Hello everyone, this is Satyaprakash and today's session is SQL Server session, and in this session we will learn what is default constraint and what are the importance of default constraint in SQL Server. So in this session we will learn that is what is default constraint and how to add default constraint in existing column of a table, and how to add default constraint in new column of an existing table, and how to add column value and with your default constraint, and how to drop or remove the default constraint. So let's get started from the that is the first point, that is what is default constraint. So default constraint is used to insert a default value into a specified column of a table, and a column default can be specified using default constraint, that is keyword, and the default value should be, that is default value will be added to all the whatever your new records if no other value is mentioned for default constraint specified column, including null value. So main point of this is, if you never not mention the not mention the value of any default constant specified column, so that value should be assigned by the default constraint what you have mentioned at the time of creating the default constraint, and also null value can be inserted if the user are used want to insert the value as a null value. And the second point is, that is how to add default constraint in existing column. So I'll tell you how to add the default constraint in existing column. So go to SQL Server. So before going through this session, visit my previous session, that is relationship between primary key and foreign key. So specially I have used, that is I have used two tables, that is one is table person, another one is table gender. So using same tables I'll implement the default constraint step by step. So our first point is what is existing, how to add the default constraint in the existing column. So for this I'll write the code for this. So alter table tbl person, add constraint, and I want to specify the name of this constraint. So that is dc underscore tbl person underscore which column you want to add, that is gender id. So it is the extension dc, that is that want to which table you want to add the constraint, and this is the column of the this specified table. So that is the constraint name, that is dc underscore tbl person underscore gender id. And next one is I want the default value, default is 1 for gender id. If the user not assign the value to the column, so default value should be assigned as the 1. So I need to execute this. So it is successfully executed. So go to this table value and just refresh the constraint part, and you will see here that is your constraint is created, default constraint is created under this table. Okay, now go to my sheet. What will the next one is? So next one is add a default constraint in new column of an existing table. If the column is not there, if you want to add a new column, so how to add in the new column of an existing table? So go to SQL Server. So I just want to comment this for better understanding, that is existing column to add a default constraint. Okay, now our next one is how to add the for new column. how to add the default constraint to for the new column to add default constraint. So for this I want to write the code, that is alter table tbl person. I want to add the new column name, that is add h int null, that is I want the name I want to add a new column name, that is h, and the data type of this column is int, and the value I have mentioned that null, default value. And I want to add the constraint for this age column, that is constraint. I want to specify the constraint name, that is c underscore tbl person, the table name, and the column name should be age, and the default value should be 18. So if the user not assign the value to the age column, the default value will be inserted as 18. Okay, now I want to execute this column name. Okay, now why it is, because I already have added there is a column name is age, that's why it did not assign to the value for this. So what I did is I just want to add a int underscore age. This error, why this error is thrown, because the already age column is mentioned in our table, so that's why it is not be specified more than once. So I want to add another one, that is int underscore age. So I'll execute again. Now it is successfully executed. I just want to refresh. So now you'll see that is the second one is generated, that is dc underscore tbl person underscore age, and this one is first one for gender id, and this one is second one for age column. Okay, now go to my sheet. So how to add the column value with and without default constraint. Okay, so go to SQL Server. So I'll tell you that is what is the value I'll assign, that is how it is fetch the default value from the default constraint for the gender id column. So I'll tell you insert into, that is tbl person, and I'll mention the columns here, id, name, and that is email and age. So remember, and I have mentioned for two columns, that is gender id and for int underscore age. So default constraint value will be implemented only of these two columns only. So that is values will be for, that is 11, and I will mention the Dinesh, and the column the mail id will be dinesh@gmail.com, and I mentioned the age is 12. So I need to insert this. So one are affected, so we'll check what is the column value. The values of the columns are mentioned from the default constraint, that is select tbl person. So I need to execute this. Okay, now I'll check the where clause, that is id for where id equal to 11. So we'll check here for id 11 Dinesh at gmail.com, and gender id I have not mentioned here, That's why one gender ID default value was inserted is as 1, and age value, as I mentioned, is 11, and the int underscore age default constant value is mentioned as default, that is 18. Okay, now especially the insert statement below does not provide a value for gender ID column, so the default of 1 will be inserted for this record, and the same for the int underscore age column, so the default of 18 will be inserted for this record. And the other hand, I'll show you the how the insert statement will insert null instead of using the default value. So I'll show you that is how it is allow the null value insert into table person, and the column name I want to specify ID, name, email, that is age, and gender ID and int underscore age, and values will be that is 12, and mention the name I will manually mention here Danny, and the mail for email I will mention danny.s@gmail.com, and for age I will mention that is 13, and for gender ID I will mention here null, because the requirement for our requirement is how to it allows the null value, and instead of using the default constraint value, that's why I mentioned here for gender ID that is null, and for int underscore age I will mention also here null. So I need to execute this. See, it is successfully inserted and the row is affected. So I'll tell you for gender for ID 12 what the values it should be. That is I execute this. See here, for ID 12 the name Danny, and the email is danny.s@gmail.com, and gender ID is null value instead of using the default constraint. So gender ID allows the null value, and age as for 13 I mentioned there, and int underscore age it also allows null value instead of using that is default constraint value. Okay, so that this one is for that is for default constraint value. I have written here because for better understanding, that's why I commented this code, this SQL query that is for without default constraint value, and this one is with default constraint value. So you guys, I think you understood that I have inserted using default constraint value for two columns which I have mentioned for default constraint, specify the default constraint columns, and the second one is I mentioned I did not mention the default constraint value, and instead of I have mentioned the null value. So specially this insert statement will insert the null value instead of using the default constant value. Okay, so go to my sheet. So add column value with and without default constraint. So it is done, and the last one is how to drop or remove default constraint. So flip to my SQL Server. So I just drag this to the down, that is for better visible. So for drop constraint that I will mention here, that is for drop constraint. So I'll tell alter table. Which table you have already added the default constraint, mention this table name, that is I have mentioned here TVL person. And the drop keyword I mentioned constraint. Which constraint you want to remove? I have assigned here two constraint, that is DC underscore TVL person underscore age and DC underscore TVL person underscore gender. So I want to remove this one. So I'll mention here that is a constraint name we want to remove. I want to execute this. So it's successfully executed. Just refresh this constraint part. So you'll see here that is DC underscore TVL person underscore age constraint is removed successfully. So as for now, we already have completed all the queries regarding default constraint. And so go to my sheet. Okay, now this one is default constraint definitions. You can read here. So this is my YouTube channel, and subscribe and share it. And for getting the up-to-date knowledge on that is .NET Core, MVC, SQL Server, Angular, Azure Data Factory, Microsoft Business Intelligence, and cloud computing tutorial. So next one is the summary part, what we have learned today, that is what the default constraint and what is the importance. So importance, especially if you don't want to add that is if you don't want to add the column name, for example, that is the two tables there. One table column is mentioned that 1 2 3, that is for TVL gender, and 1 is for male, 2 is for female, 3 is for unknown. And the second table TVL person, there is a column name gender ID. If you don't want to assign the gender ID, so by default it will be taken as the value 3, that is unknown. So that is the importance. And the user, if wants to add the null value, it can accept the null values of specified default constraint columns. And second one is how to add the default constraint in the existing column, and how to add the default constraint in a new column of an existing table, and how to add column value with and without default constraint. So and how to add or remove default constraint, how to drop or remove default constraint using the query. So I'll tell you, that is this SQL query part is very important. You can refer here. That is I already have mentioned all the queries. That is for first one is existing column to our default constraint, new column to our default constraint of existing table, and this one is for that is insert statement below does not provide a value for gender ID and int underscore age. So the default of 1 and 1 for gender ID and 18 for int underscore age column will be inserted, that is accept the default constant value, that one. And here if there is a select statement after the insert part successfully, so that's why I mentioned the with default constant value. And the second one is that is the insert statement will insert null value instead of using default constant. So I have mentioned the null value for gender ID int underscore age, which these columns are specified as a default constant value, so it accepts null values to be inserted successfully. And this one is a without default constant value select statement. And last one is for drop constraint. This query is used to drop the constraint as per your requirement. So this till now there is a 1 2 3, that is 4, and there is a 5, that is 5 SQL queries there. If you want to refer this SQL query here, that is for better understanding. I have mentioned with few comments. I just want to check anything I have missed or not. That is the existing column, new column, insert statement with default value, insert statement with default value, and this one is for default drop constraint. Okay, so that's all about, guys. So in this summary part we have learned the following details. So that's it for today. Thank you for listening and have a great day. Thank you very much and share it.